डॉक्टर बाबा साहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar and greetings of the day to all the students watching this video. I, Twinkle Chandarana, Assistant Professor English, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, welcome all of you in today's lecture. So friends, you might be wondering about the topic to be discussed in today's session. Well, today we are going to discuss an interesting absurd play titled as A Tragicomedy in Two Acts. Having already discussed the brief summary, themes and characterization in this play, let us now have a look at the critical aspects of this play. To start with, let us try to understand the concept of the theatre of absurd. With the appearance of an attendant Godot, that is, waiting for Godot, at the Théâtre de Babylone in Paris in the year 1953, the literary world was shocked by the appearance of a drama so different and yet so intriguing that it virtually created the term theatre of the absurd. And the entire group of dramas which developed out of this type of theatre is always associated with the name of Samuel Beckett. His contribution to this particular genre allows us to refer to him as the Grand Master or to be precise as the father of this genre. While other dramatists have also contributed significantly to this genre, Beckett remains its single most towering figure till now. This movement, known as the Theatre of Absurd, was not a consciously conceived movement and it has never had any clear-cut philosophical doctrines, or it had no organized attempt to win converts and no meetings. Each of main playwrights of the movement seems to have developed independently of each other. The playwrights most often associated with the movement are Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, Jean Genet, and Arthur Adamou. The early plays of Edward Albee and Harold Pinter fit into this classification, but these dramatists have also written plays that move far away from the theatre of the absurd's basic elements. In viewing the plays that comprise this movement, we must forsake the theatre of coherently developed situations. We must forsake characterizations that are rooted in the logic of motivation and reaction. And we must sometimes also forget settings that bear an intrinsic, realistic, or obvious relation to the drama as a whole. We must also forget the use of language as a tool of logical communication. And we must forget cause and effect relationships found in traditional dramas. By their use of a number of puzzling devices, these playwrights have gradually accustomed audiences to a new kind of relationship between theme and presentation. In this seemingly queer and fantastic plays, the external world is often depicted as menacing, daring, and unknown. The settings and situations often make us vaguely uncomfortable. The world itself seems incoherent and frightening and strange, but at the same time, it seems hauntingly poetic and familiar. These are some of the reasons which prompt the critic to classify them under the heading Theatre of the Absurd, a title which comes not from a dictionary definition of the word absurd but rather from Martin Eslin's book, The Theatre of the Absurd, in which he maintains that these dramatists write from a sense of metaphysical anguish at the absurdity of the human condition. But other writers such as Kafka, Camus, and Sartre have also argued from the same philosophical position. The essential difference is that critics like Camus have presented their arguments in a highly formal discourse with logical and precise views which prove their thesis within the framework of traditional forms. And on the contrary, the theatre of the absurd seeks to wed from content into an indissoluble whole in order to gain a further unity of meaning and impact. This theatre, as Aislinn has pointed out, has renounced arguing about the absurdity of the human condition. It merely presents it in being that is terms of concrete stage images of the absurdity of existence. Too often, however, the viewer notes only these basic similarities and fails to note the distinctive differences in each dramatist. Since these writers do not belong to any deliberate or conscious movement, they should be evaluated for their individual concerns as well as for their contributions to the total concept of the theatre of the absurd. In fact, most of these playwrights consider themselves to be lonely rebels and outsiders, isolated in their own private worlds. As noted above, there have been no manifestos, no theses, no conferences, and no collaborations. Each has developed along his own unique lines. Each, in his own way, is individually and distinctively different. Therefore, it is important to see how Becquet both belongs to the theatre of the absurd and, equally important, how he differs from the other writers associated with this movement. First, let us note a few of the basic differences. One of Samuel Becquet's main concerns is the polarity of existence. In Waiting for Godot, Endgame, and Crape's Last Tape, we have such characteristic polarities as sight versus blindness, life versus death, time present versus time past, body versus intellect, and waiting versus not waiting, going versus not going, and dozens more. One of Becquet's main concerns then seems to be characterizing man's existence in terms of these polarities. To do this, Becquet groups his characters in pairs. For example, we have Vladimir and Estragon, or Didi and Gogo, or we have Hem and Claw, or we have Pozo and Lucky, we have Nag and Nail, and Crape's present voice and past voice. Essentially, however, Becquet's characters remain a puzzle which each individual viewer must solve. In contrast to Becquet, Eugene Ionesco's characters are seen in terms of singularity, whereas Becquet's characters stand in pairs outside of society, but converse with each other. Ionesco's characters are placed in the midst of society, but they stand alone in an alien world with no personal identity and no one with whom they can communicate. For example, the characters in The Bald Soprano are in society, but they scream meaningless phrases at each other and there is no communication. And whereas Becquet's play takes place on strange and alien landscapes, some of the settings of his plays remind one of a world transformed by some Holocaust or created by some surrealist. Ionesco's plays are set against the most traditional elements in our society. The standard English drawing room in The Bald Soprano, a typical street scene in Rhinoceros, and an average academic study in The Lesson, etc. The language of the two playwrights also differs greatly. Becquet's dialogue recalls the disjointed phantasmagoria of a dream world, Ionesco's language is rooted in the banalities, the cliches, the platitudes of everyday speech. Beckett uses language to show men isolated in the world and unable to communicate because language is a barrier to communication. And Ionesco, on the other hand, uses language to show the failure of communication because there is nothing because there is because there is nothing to because there is nothing to say in the bold soprano and other plays. The dialogue is filled with cliches and platitudes. In contrast to the basic sympathy we feel for both Beckett's and Ionesco's characters, Jean Genet's characters almost revile the audience from the moment that they appear on the stage. His theme is stated more openly. He is concerned with the hatred which exists in the world. In The Maids, for example, each maid hates not just her employer and not just her own sister, but also her own self. Therefore, she plays the other roles so as to exhaust her own hatred of herself against herself. Basically, there is a great sense of repugnance in Janet's characters. This revulsion derives partially from the fact that Janet's dramatic interest, so different from Beckett's and Ionesco's, is in the psychological exploration of man's predilection to being trapped in his own egocentric world, rather than facing the realities of existence. Man for Janet is trapped by his own fantastic illusions, and man's absurdity results partially from the fact that he prefers his own disjointed images to those of reality. In Janet's directions for the production of The Blacks, he writes that the play should never be played before a totally black audience. If there are no white people present, then one of the blacks in the audience must wear a white mask. If the black refuses, then a white mannequin must be used and the actors must play the drama for this mannequin. There must be at least a symbol of a white audience, someone for the black actors to revile. So friends, these were the differences. Let us now discuss the similarities. Since all of the writers have varying concerns, they also have much in common because their works reflect a moral and philosophical climate in which most of our civilization finds it today. Again, as noted above, even though there are no manifestos nor any organized movements, there are still certain concerns that are basic to all of these writers, and Beckett's works are concerned with these basic ideas. Beyond the technical and strange illusionary techniques which prompt the critic to group these plays into a category, there are larger and ultimately more significant concerns by which each dramatist, in spite of his artistic differences, is akin to the others, is similar to the others. Aside from such similarities as violation of traditional beginning, middle, and end structure, that is the exposition, complication, and denouement, or the refusal to tell a straightforward, connected story with a proper plot, or the disappearance of traditional dramatic forms and techniques, these dramatists are all concerned with the failure of communication in modern society, which leaves man alienated. Moreover, they are all concerned with the lack of individuality and the overemphasis on conformity in our society. and they use the dramatic elements of time and place to imply important ideas. And finally, they reject traditional logic for a type of non logic which ultimately implies something about the nature of the universe. Implicit in many of these concerns is an attack on a society or a world which possesses no set standard of values or behavior. Foremost, all of these dramatists of the absurd are concerned with the lack of communication. In Edward Albee's plays, each character is existing within the bounds of his own private ego. Each makes a futile attempt to get another character to understand him, but as the attempt is heightened, there is more alienation. Becke's characters are tied together by a fear of being left entirely alone, and they therefore cling to one last hope of establishing some kind of communication. His plays give the impression that man is totally lost in an disintegrating society, or as in his play The Endgame, that man is left alone after society has disintegrated him. In the play Waiting for Godot, two derelicts are seen conversing in a repetitive, strangely fragmented dialogue that possesses an illusory, haunting effect while they are waiting for Godot, a vague, never defined being who will bring them some communication about what? Salvation, death, an impetus for living, a reason for dying? No one knows. The safest thing to say is that the two are probably waiting for someone or something which will give them an impetus to continue living, or at least something which will give meaning and direction to their lives, to their existence. As Becke clearly demonstrates that those who rush hither and thither in search of meaning find it no quicker than those who sit and wait. The meaning about life that these tramps hope for is never stated precisely, but Becke never meant his play to be a message play in which one character would deliver a message. The message here is conveyed through the interaction of the characters and primarily through the interaction of the two tramps. Everyone leaves the theatre with the knowledge that these tramps are strangely tied to one another, even though they bicker and fight, and even though they have exhausted all conversation. Notice that the second act is repetitive and almost identical. The loneliness and weakness in each calls out to the other, and they are held by a mystical bond of interdependence. In spite of this strange dependency, however, neither is able to communicate with the other. The other two characters, Pozo and Lucky, are on a journey without any apparent goal and are symbolically tied together. One talks, the other says nothing. The waiting of Vladimir and Estragon and the journeying of Pozo and Lucky offer themselves as contrast of various activities in the modern world, all of which lead to no fruitful end. Therefore, each pair is hopelessly alienated from the other pair. For example, when Pozo falls and yells for help, Vladimir and Estragon continue talking. Although nothing is communicated in their dialogue, all is hopeless, or as Vladimir apostrophistically replies to one of Estragon's long discourses, I quote, "We are all born mad, and some remain so," unquote. In their attempts at conversation and communication, these two tramps have a fastidious correctness and a grave propriety that suggests that they could be socially accepted, but their fastidiousness and propriety are inordinately comic when contrasted with their raged appearance. Their fumbling ineffectuality in their attempts at conversation seems to represent the ineptness of all mankind in its attempt at communication. And it rapidly becomes apparent that Vladimir and Estragon, as representatives of modern man, cannot formulate any cogent or useful resolution or action. And what is more pathetic, they cannot communicate their helpless longings to one another. While failing to possess enough individualism to go their separate ways, they nevertheless are different enough to embrace most of our society. In the final analysis, their one positive gesture is their strength to wait. But man is ultimately terribly alone in his waiting. Each dramatist, therefore, presents a critic of modern society by showing the total collapse of communication. The technique used is that of evolving a theme about communication by presenting a series of seemingly disjointed speeches. The accumulative effect of these speeches is a devastating commentary on the failure of communication in modern society. In conjunction with the general attack on communication, the second aspect common to these dramatists is lack of individuality encountered in modern civilization. Generally, the point seems to be that man does not know himself. He has lost all sense of individualism and either functions isolated and alienated, or else finds himself lost amid repetition and conformity. Other dramatists present their attack on society's destruction of individualism by different means, but the attack still has the same thematic intent. Perhaps more than any of the other dramatists of the absurd, Ionesco has concerned himself almost exclusively with the failure of individualism, especially in his most famous play, Rhinoceros. To repeat, in this play, our society today has emphasized conformity to such an extent and has rejected individualism so completely that Ionesco demonstrates with inverse logic how stupid it is not to conform to all society and be metamorphosized into a rhinoceros. This play aptly illustrates how two concerns of the absurdist, lack of communication and the lack of individualism, are combined, each to support the other. Much of Ionesco's dialogue in this play seems to be the distilled essence of the commonplace. One cliché follows another, and yet, in contrast, this dialogue is spoken within the framework of a wildly improbable situation. At first glance, it would seem obvious that Ionesco wishes to indicate the triumph of the individual, who, although caught in a society that has gone mad, refuses to surrender his sense of identity. But if we look more closely, we see that Ionesco has no intention of leaving us on this hopeful and comforting note. In his last speech, Berenger, a character in the play of Ionesco, makes it clear that his stand is rendered absurd. What does his humanity avail him in a world of beasts? Finally, he wishes that he also had changed. Now it is too late. All he can do is feebly reassert his joy in being human. His statement carries little conviction. This is how Ionesco deals with the haunting theme of the basic meaning and value of personal identity in relationship to society. If one depends entirely upon the society in which one lives for a sense of reality and identity, it is impossible to take a stand against that society without reducing oneself to nothingness in the process. Berenger instinctively felt repelled by the tyranny that had sprung up around him, but he had no sense of identity that would have enabled him to combat this evil with anything but resembling a positive force. Probably any action he could have taken would have led to eventual defeat, but defeat would have been infinitely preferable to the limbo in which he is finally consigned. Ionesco has masterfully joined two themes, the lack of individualism and the failure of communication. But unlike Beke, who handles the same themes by presenting his characters as derelicts and outcasts from the society, Ionesco's treatment seems even more devastating because he places them in the very middle of the society from which they are estranged. Ultimately, the absurdity of man's condition is partially a result of his being compelled to exist without his individualism in a society which does not possess any degree of effective communication. Essentially, therefore, the theatre of the absurd is not a positive drama. It does not try to prove that men can exist in a meaningless world, as did Camus and Sartre, and nor does it offer any solution. Instead, it demonstrates absurdity, the absurdity and illogicality of the world we live in. Nothing is ever settled. There are no positive statements, no conclusions are ever reached, and what few actions there are have no meaning, particularly in relation to the action. That is, one action carries no more significance than does its opposite action. For example, the man's tying his shoe in the bald soprano, a common occurrence, is magnified into a momentous act, while the appearance of rhinoceros in the middle of a calm afternoon seems to be not at all consequential and evokes only the most trite and insignificant remarks. In the same way, Pozo and Lucky's frantic running and searching are no more important than Vladimir and Estragon's sitting and waiting. And Janet presents his blacks as outcasts and misfits from society, but refrains from making any positive statement regarding the black person's role in our society. The question of whether society is to be integrated or segregated is to Janet a matter of absolute indifference. It would still be society and the individual would still be outside it. No conclusions or resolutions can ever be offered. Therefore, because these plays are essentially circular and repetitive in nature, in all of these playwrights' dramas, the sense of repetition, the circular structure, the static quality, the lack of cause and effect, and the lack of apparent progression all suggest the sterility and lack of values in the modern world. Early critics referred to the theatre of the absurd as a theatre in transition, meaning that it was to lead to something different. So far, this has not happened, but the theatre of the absurd is rapidly becoming accepted as a distinct genre in its own right. The themes utilized by the dramatists of this movement are not new. Thus, the success of the plays must often depend upon the effectiveness of the techniques and the new ways by which the dramatists illustrate their themes. The techniques are still so new, however, that many people are confused by a production of one of these plays. Yet, if the technique serves to emphasize the absurdity of man's position in the universe, then to present this concept by a series of ridiculous situations is only to render man's position even more absurd and in actuality, the techniques then reinforce that very condition which the dramatist bewail. In other words, to present the failure of communication by a series of disjointed and seemingly discoherent utterances lends itself to the accusation that functionalism is carried to a ridiculous extreme. But this is exactly what the absurdist wants to do. He is tired of logical discourses pointing out step by step the absurdity of the universe. He begins with the philosophical premise that the universe is absurd and then creates plays which illustrates conclusively that the universe is indeed absurd and that perhaps displays another additional absurdity. In conclusion, if the public can accept these unusual uses of technique to support thematic concerns, then we have plays which dramatically present powerful and vivid views on the absurdity of the human condition, and absurdity which is the result of the destruction of individualism and the failure of communication, of man being forced to conform to a world of mediocrity where no action is meaningful. As the tragic outcast of these plays are presented in terms of burlesque, man is reminded that his position and that of human existence in general is essentially absurd. Every play in the theatre of the absurd movement mirrors the chaos and basic disorientation of modern man. Each play laughs in the anguish at the confusion that exists in contemporary society. Hence, all share a basic point of view while varying widely in scope and structure. So friends, towards the end of lecture, I hope that you would have understood the basic concept of the theatre of absurd, its origin and development. We shall discuss another such interesting plays in the upcoming lectures. Thank you, dear friends, for listening.
स्वाध्यायः परमं तप